My name is Grace Hamilton. I'm 33 years old, and when I walked into my grandfather Edgar's will reading expecting to receive maybe a small keepsake or family photo to remember the man who had been my biggest supporter, his attorney instead handed me legal documents showing that I had inherited his entire $25 million estate, while my corporate lawyer sister Jennifer and investment banker brother Michael received nothing. What my family didn't know was that their immediate demands for me to redistribute the money fairly, because I was too simple to understand real wealth, would trigger the very protections my grandfather had built into his will, designed specifically to test whether his chosen heir would cave to family greed or honor his true wishes for helping children who had nothing. The law office of Peterson, Clark & Associates felt intimidating that Tuesday morning as I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room, surrounded by my parents William and Helen Hamilton, my sister Jennifer, who worked at a prestigious downtown law firm, and my brother Michael, who managed investments for wealthy clients at a major bank. Everyone was dressed in expensive business attire that probably cost more than my monthly teacher's salary, while I wore the simple black dress I had purchased at Target for school events and funerals. "We're here for the reading of Edgar Hamilton's last will and testament," announced Mr. Peterson, my grandfather's longtime attorney, as he reviewed documents that would determine how my grandfather's substantial fortune would be distributed among his surviving family members. I had always known my grandfather was wealthy from his successful manufacturing business, but I had never imagined being included in inheritance discussions alongside family members who earned six-figure salaries and drove luxury cars, while I lived in a modest apartment and drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic that I was still paying off through careful monthly budgeting. Edgar Hamilton was very specific about his final wishes and the reasoning behind his inheritance decisions, Mr. I. Peterson continued as he opened the sealed will that had been prepared 6 months before my grandfather's peaceful death at age 87. My grandfather had been the only family member who never criticized my decision to become an elementary school teacher, instead of pursuing what my family considered serious careers in business, law, or medicine. While everyone else questioned my choice to work with underprivileged children for $42,000 per year, Grandpa Edgar had always told me that I had the biggest heart in the family, and that teaching was the most important work anyone could do. To my granddaughter Grace Hamilton, who has dedicated her life to nurturing young minds and helping children discover their potential, I leave my entire estate valued at approximately $25 million. Mr. Sao. Peterson read from the will, his words hitting the room like a bomb that instantly transformed the atmosphere from respectful anticipation to shocked disbelief. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat as I processed what I had just heard. $25 million. To me. The teacher who lived paycheck to paycheck and used her own money to buy school supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. "That can't be right," Jennifer said, her voice sharp with disbelief and growing anger. "Read it again. There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Mr. Peterson replied calmly, as he handed me the legal documents that officially made me one of the wealthiest people I had ever known. Edgar Hamilton was very clear about his decision and his reasoning. Michael leaned forward aggressively, his face red with rage. "This is insane. Grace teaches children for barely above minimum wage. She doesn't understand investments, business management, or financial planning. How could Dad give her everything while his successful children get nothing?" "Your father included a detailed explanation of his reasoning," Mr. Peterson said, pulling out another document. "He wrote that Grace was the only family member who chose service over profit, compassion over accumulation, and helping others over helping herself. Have you ever been in a room where people you loved suddenly looked at you with pure hatred because of something completely outside your control? That's exactly what I was experiencing as my family's shock transformed into fury, directed at me rather than appreciation for my grandfather's generous recognition of my work. The inheritance documents felt surreal in my hands as I tried to process the magnitude of what my grandfather had done. $25 million would eliminate every financial worry I had ever experienced, allow me to help countless children, and provide security I had never dreamed possible on a teacher's salary. But the look in my family's eyes told me that accepting my grandfather's gift would come with a price I had never anticipated: the permanent destruction of every family relationship I had cherished throughout my life. The family meeting that followed the will reading became the most hostile confrontation I had ever experienced, as my parents and siblings immediately began strategizing ways to force me to redistribute my grandfather's money according to what they considered fair, rather than honoring his explicit wishes about who should inherit his life's work. "Grace, you need to understand that this inheritance decision doesn't make any sense," my father William said with the authoritative tone he used when he expected immediate compliance with his wishes. "You're a wonderful teacher, but you have no experience managing large amounts of money or making the kind of investment decisions that will protect this wealth for future generations." The implication that I was incompetent to handle my own inheritance because I had chosen education over finance was both insulting and typical of how my family had always viewed my career choice as evidence of poor judgment rather than dedication to serving others. "Dad's right," Michael added with the aggressive confidence that had made him successful in investment banking. $25 million requires sophisticated financial management, tax planning, and investment strategies that you've never dealt with. The responsible thing to do is transfer the money to people who understand wealth management. The suggestion that responsible financial management required transferring my inheritance to them revealed everything I needed to know about their motivations and their complete disregard for my grandfather's wishes or my own decision-making capabilities. "We're not trying to take anything away from you," Jennifer said with the manipulative tone she used in legal negotiations. "We just want to make sure the money is handled properly, so everyone benefits from Grandpa's success, instead of seeing it mismanaged by someone who's never dealt with serious financial planning." The characterization of honoring my grandfather's will as mismanagement, while presenting their redistribution demands as protection for my interests, was both legally absurd and morally bankrupt. But it was also revealing about their fundamental inability to accept that their grandfather had chosen someone else to inherit his wealth. "Here's what we're proposing," Helen said as she pulled out handwritten notes that showed they had been planning this intervention since leaving the lawyer's office. "Divide the $25 million equally among all 4 family members. That gives everyone $625 million, which is more than enough for your needs while ensuring that the money goes to people who can manage it responsibly." The detailed redistribution plan that my mother had calculated while we drove from the law office revealed how quickly they had moved from shock about the inheritance to planning its seizure, without any consideration of my grandfather's intentions or my right to accept his generous gift. "Mom, Grandpa specifically chose to leave his money to me," I said, trying to defend my inheritance while dealing with the psychological pressure of 4 family members who were treating my grandfather's decision as a mistake that needed correction, rather than a deliberate choice that deserved respect. Grandpa was 87 years old, and probably not thinking clearly about the implications of giving so much money to someone who's never earned more than $45,000 in a single year. William replied, with dismissive confidence about my grandfather's mental capacity and decision-making authority. "Besides," Jennifer added, "keeping all that money for yourself would be incredibly selfish when you have family members who could use it for important purposes like paying off student loans, buying houses, and investing for retirement." The moral manipulation that characterized my acceptance of my grandfather's gift as selfish, while treating their demands for redistribution as legitimate family needs, was both emotionally manipulative and logically inconsistent with basic principles of inheritance law and personal property rights. Have you ever been told that accepting a gift someone chose to give you was actually stealing from people who felt entitled to that gift instead? That's exactly what I was experiencing as my family reframed my grandfather's deliberate inheritance decision as unfair distribution that I was morally obligated to correct. "Grace, we're giving you an opportunity to do the right thing voluntarily," Michael said with obvious impatience at my continued resistance to their redistribution demands. "But if you won't be reasonable about sharing this money, we might have to explore legal options for protecting our father's estate from mismanagement." The threat of legal action to override my grandfather's will was both intimidating and revealing about how far my family was willing to go to claim money that had been specifically left to someone else based on character judgments they were proving to be accurate through their own behavior. "What kind of legal options?" I asked, feeling increasingly anxious about their escalating demands and their obvious coordination in pressuring me to surrender my inheritance. "Contesting the will based on Dad's diminished capacity, undue influence, or improper estate planning," Jennifer replied with professional confidence about legal strategies she could pursue to overturn her grandfather's inheritance decisions. Courts are often sympathetic to cases where elderly people make unusual bequests that don't reflect their long-term family relationships. The casual discussion of legal strategies to steal my inheritance, while characterizing my grandfather's thoughtful decision as evidence of mental incapacity, was both cruel and hypocritical, since they were proving his assessment of their character through their immediate attempts to overturn his wishes. But while my family planned their legal and emotional assault on my inheritance, I was beginning to remember conversations with my grandfather that suggested he had anticipated exactly this kind of family reaction and had taken steps to protect his chosen beneficiary from the greed and manipulation he knew his wealth would inspire. Grandpa Edgar was always worried about how money would affect family relationships, I thought, as I recalled his frequent comments about wealthy families destroyed by inheritance disputes and his admiration for my choice to prioritize service over salary in my career decisions. The woman sitting in that hostile family meeting, surrounded by relatives demanding redistribution of her inheritance, was about to discover that her grandfather's gift came with protections she had never imagined and consequences for family greed that would permanently alter the dynamics of their relationships. The escalation from family pressure to actual violence happened so quickly that I barely had time to process what was occurring, as my brother Michael's frustration with my continued resistance exploded into physical aggression that would trigger legal consequences he had never anticipated. "Grace, we've been trying to reason with you for 2 hours, and you're still being stubborn and selfish about sharing money that belongs to the whole family," Michael said as his voice rose with anger that had been building throughout our confrontation. "If you won't voluntarily do the right thing, then maybe we need to take more direct action." The threat of more direct action was vague but ominous, suggesting that Michael had moved beyond legal and emotional manipulation to consider physical intervention that would force me to comply with their redistribution demands regardless of my wishes or my grandfather's intentions. "Michael, I need time to think about this situation and understand what Grandpa wanted me to do with this money," I said, trying to de-escalate the confrontation while maintaining my right to make independent decisions about an inheritance I had never expected or asked for. "There's nothing to think about," Jennifer interjected with the aggressive tone she used in courtroom arguments. "The situation is simple. You have money that should be shared with family members who need it and can manage it responsibly. Every minute you delay is another minute of selfish behavior that hurts people who love you." The characterization of my request for time to consider my options as selfish behavior that was actively harming family members was both emotionally manipulative and logically absurd, since my grandfather's inheritance had been his to distribute according to his own values and priorities. "Grace, your grandfather would be ashamed of how you're handling this inheritance," Helen said with obvious disappointment, designed to make me feel guilty about honoring my grandfather's wishes rather than surrendering to family pressure. He raised us to share with each other and take care of family members who need help. The invocation of my grandfather's values in service of demands he had specifically rejected through his will was both hypocritical and revealing about my family's willingness to distort his memory to justify their attempts to claim money he had deliberately withheld from them. "Mom, Grandpa chose to leave his money to me," I replied, trying to defend my inheritance while dealing with escalating pressure from people who were treating my grandfather's decision as a mistake rather than a deliberate choice based on years of observing his family's behavior and values. "Grandpa was manipulated by your fake sweetness and your sob stories about poor children." Michael exploded with rage that revealed his true feelings about my work and my relationship with our grandfather. "He fell for your act about being a caring teacher, when you were really just positioning yourself to inherit his money. The accusation that my dedication to teaching and my genuine relationship with my grandfather had been calculated manipulation designed to secure his inheritance was both personally devastating and completely false. But it also revealed Michael's fundamental inability to understand authentic compassion or service-oriented career choices. "That's enough," I said, standing up to leave the conference room where this hostile family meeting was taking place. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to you attack my character and my relationship with Grandpa just because you're angry about his inheritance decisions." But as I reached for the inheritance documents that Mr. Peterson had given me, Michael lunged forward and snatched them from my hands with violence that shocked everyone in the room, including his own family members who hadn't expected him to resort to physical aggression. "You want these documents?" Michael screamed as he held my inheritance papers above his head. "Fine. If we can't have the money, then nobody gets anything." Before anyone could stop him, Michael began tearing the legal documents into pieces, destroying what he believed was my access to the $25 million inheritance while screaming about fairness and family obligations that justified his destruction of my grandfather's final wishes. "There!" Michael shouted as he threw the paper fragments across the conference room. "You'll get nothing now. We win. Maybe next time you'll think about sharing instead of being greedy and selfish." The destruction of what Michael believed were my inheritance documents was both shocking and revealing about how far my family was willing to go to prevent me from keeping money that my grandfather had specifically chosen to give me rather than them. "Michael, what have you done?" Helen gasped as she stared at the paper fragments scattered across the expensive conference room carpet. "Those were Grace's inheritance documents." "I did what I had to do to teach her a lesson about family loyalty," Michael replied with satisfaction about his destructive gesture. "If she won't share voluntarily, then destroying the documents ensures that nobody benefits from Dad's misguided inheritance decision." Have you ever watched someone destroy what they thought was your financial future while celebrating their success and harming you? That's exactly what I was experiencing as Michael congratulated himself on eliminating my access to my grandfather's inheritance through violence and document destruction. "You were never smart enough to handle real money anyway," Helen added with cruel satisfaction about Michael's destructive intervention. "Maybe losing the inheritance will teach you to be more cooperative when family members try to help you make better decisions." The suggestion that destroying my inheritance documents was help with decision-making, while characterizing my acceptance of my grandfather's gift as evidence of inadequate intelligence, revealed the depth of my family's contempt for my achievements and their fundamental misunderstanding of the situation they had created. "We're going to contest the will anyway," Jennifer announced with professional confidence about legal strategies that would ensure my inheritance remained within the family, even if Michael's document destruction had eliminated my immediate access to the money. Courts don't like unusual inheritances that ignore traditional family distribution patterns. But as I looked at the scattered paper fragments that represented my family's willingness to destroy what they couldn't control, I found myself beginning to laugh rather than cry, because I was remembering something my grandfather had told me about protecting important documents and anticipating family greed that would be triggered by wealth distribution decisions. The laughter that escaped me as I processed Michael's destructive gesture was both genuine and strategic, because I knew something that my family had never discovered. My grandfather had been much more sophisticated about protecting his chosen beneficiary than they had ever imagined possible. The moment when I started laughing while looking at the torn documents scattered across the conference room floor shocked my family into silence, as they tried to understand why I was amused rather than devastated by Michael's destruction of what they believed was my access to our grandfather's $25 million inheritance. "Why are you laughing?" Jennifer demanded with confusion about my reaction to losing what she assumed was my financial future. "Michael just destroyed your inheritance documents. You should be crying, not laughing." The expectation that I should be devastated by Michael's destructive gesture, rather than finding humor in his ignorance about the legal protections my grandfather had established, revealed how little my family understood about sophisticated estate planning and document security for large inheritances. I'm laughing because you have no idea what you've actually accomplished, I said, as my amusement grew at their shock and confusion about my unexpected reaction to their attempt to sabotage my grandfather's inheritance wishes. What are you talking about? William asked with growing suspicion that my laughter indicated knowledge or preparation they hadn't anticipated during their planning of emotional and physical pressure campaigns designed to force inheritance redistribution. I'm talking about the fact that Grandpa Edgar knew his family much better than you ever realized. I replied with satisfaction about discoveries I was beginning to make about my grandfather's sophisticated understanding of family dynamics and his preparation for exactly the kind of greed and violence my family had just demonstrated. Grace, stop being cryptic and explain what you mean, Helen demanded with impatience about my continued amusement in the face of what they believed was successful sabotage of my financial future. I mean that Grandpa anticipated exactly this kind of behavior from family members who would feel entitled to money he chose to give someone else, I said as I began to understand the full scope of my grandfather's planning and protection strategies. He told me stories about wealthy families destroyed by inheritance disputes, and he was determined to protect his chosen beneficiary from that kind of manipulation and violence. The reference to my grandfather's awareness of family inheritance dynamics and his concern about protecting beneficiaries from greedy relatives was beginning to make my family uncomfortable as they realized their behavior might have been anticipated and planned for rather than being the surprise intervention they had assumed it would be. What kind of protection are you talking about? Michael asked with growing anxiety about the implications of his document destruction and the possibility that his violent gesture had been ineffective or counterproductive. The kind of protection that makes tearing up ceremonial documents completely meaningless, I replied with growing confidence about my grandfather's sophisticated approach to estate planning and beneficiary security. Have you ever felt the satisfaction of watching people realize that their attempt to harm you had been anticipated and neutralized by someone who understood their character better than they understood themselves? That's exactly what I was experiencing as my family began to grasp that their destructive behavior might have consequences they had never considered. Those documents you destroyed were just ceremonial copies for the will reading, I continued, as Mr. Peterson nodded with approval at my understanding of the legal arrangements my grandfather had established. The real inheritance is protected in an irrevocable trust that can't be destroyed through document vandalism or family intimidation. The revelation that Michael's violent destruction had been directed against worthless copies rather than my actual access to the inheritance was both embarrassing for him and vindicating for me, since it proved that my grandfather had successfully anticipated and neutralized exactly the kind of family sabotage we had just experienced. But more importantly, I said as I remembered additional conversations with my grandfather about family values and character assessment, Grandpa included what he called a family greed clause in his estate planning that would test whether his chosen beneficiary would cave to family pressure or honor his wishes for helping others. The mention of testing mechanisms built into my inheritance was beginning to create real anxiety among family members who were starting to understand that their behavior might have triggered consequences they had never anticipated during their planning of pressure campaigns and document destruction. What kind of consequences? Jennifer asked with professional concern about legal implications she was beginning to recognize might affect her own financial interests rather than just mine. The kind that permanently exclude family members from other inheritances they didn't know existed, I replied, as Mr. Peterson began retrieving additional legal documents that would reveal the full scope of my grandfather's estate planning and the penalties for attempting to coerce his chosen beneficiary. Your grandfather established multiple trust funds and foundations that were designed to benefit family members who demonstrated character and integrity, Mr. Peterson explained as he reviewed documents that detailed financial arrangements my family had never been informed about during my grandfather's lifetime. However, Mr. Peterson continued, any family member who attempted to coerce, threaten, or intimidate the primary beneficiary would forfeit their access to these additional inheritance opportunities, regardless of their financial needs or family relationships. The explanation that their pressure campaign and Michael's violence had triggered penalty clauses that would exclude them from inheritance opportunities they had never known existed was both shocking and satisfying, since it meant their greed had ultimately cost them far more than they had tried to steal from me. "You're saying that our behavior today has consequences beyond just Grace's inheritance?" William asked with growing horror about the financial implications of their failed intervention. "I'm saying that your behavior today was exactly what Edgar Hamilton expected from family members who valued money more than character, Mr. Peterson replied with professional satisfaction about estate planning that had successfully identified and penalized the kind of greed that destroys families and corrupts relationships. The realization that my grandfather had anticipated their behavior and built consequences into his estate planning that would permanently alter their financial futures was both devastating for my family and vindicating for me, since it proved that his assessment of our different characters had been accurate and his inheritance decisions had been both deliberate and well-founded. The comprehensive revelation of my grandfather's estate planning protections and the consequences my family had triggered through their greedy behavior created a silence in the conference room that was both shocked and defeated, as they began to understand the magnitude of what they had lost through their attempts to steal what my grandfather had chosen to give me. Edgar Hamilton established a $5 million educational trust fund that would have provided college scholarships for family members' children, Mr. Peterson explained, as he reviewed legal documents that detailed inheritance opportunities my family was now permanently excluded from accessing. However, the trust includes specific exclusions for descendants of family members who attempted to coerce the primary beneficiary. The revelation that Michael and Jennifer's children would be excluded from educational funding because of their parents' behavior today was both shocking and appropriate, since it ensured that the consequences of greed would extend to future generations who might have inherited their parents' values regarding money and family relationships. There's also a $3 million family foundation that provides emergency assistance for medical expenses, disaster relief, and other unexpected financial needs, Mr. Peterson continued as he documented additional penalties that my family's behavior had triggered. Access to foundation support is similarly restricted for family members who demonstrated greed over character during the inheritance process. The loss of access to emergency financial support was particularly devastating for my parents, whose retirement savings were limited and who had been counting on family financial safety nets they had never been informed about, but had now forfeited through their attempted coercion of my inheritance decisions. Finally, Mr. Peterson said as he reached the most significant consequence of their behavior, Edgar Hamilton established a business succession trust that would have provided opportunities for family members to purchase his manufacturing company at below-market prices, ensuring that his business legacy remained within the family. That opportunity is now permanently closed to anyone who participated in today's coercion attempt, Mr. Peterson continued with professional satisfaction about estate planning that had successfully protected family assets from relatives who had demonstrated their inability to respect inheritance decisions or family harmony. The loss of business succession opportunities was particularly devastating for Michael, whose investment banking career had given him the skills to manage and expand my grandfather's manufacturing business into a family empire that could have provided wealth and employment for multiple generations. "You're telling us that our attempt to convince Grace to share her inheritance has cost us millions of dollars in other opportunities we didn't know existed?" Helen asked with growing horror about the scope of their financial losses. "I'm telling you that your coercion, threats, and destruction of legal documents triggered every penalty clause that Edgar Hamilton included to protect his chosen beneficiary from exactly the kind of family greed you demonstrated today, Mr. Furr." Peterson replied with professional finality about consequences that were both immediate and permanent. Have you ever watched people realize that their cruelest behavior had cost them far more than they had tried to gain through their manipulation and violence? That's exactly what I was witnessing as my family understood that their greed had triggered a cascade of financial consequences that would affect their security for decades to come. "Grace, you have to help us fix this situation. Jennifer pleaded with desperate hope that I might be able to reverse the consequences they had triggered through their own behavior. Family members make mistakes when they're emotional about money. Surely you can convince the lawyers to overlook what happened today. The expectation that I would rescue them from consequences they had created through their own greed and violence was both entitled and hypocritical, since they had just finished trying to destroy my financial future while characterizing my resistance as selfish and unreasonable behavior. Jennifer, you just spent 2 hours trying to force me to give up my inheritance, and Michael physically destroyed what he thought were my legal documents. I replied with calm clarity about the situation they had created. Why would I help you avoid the consequences of behavior that was designed to harm me? Because we're family, William said with the same moral manipulation he had used to justify their redistribution demands. Family members forgive each other and work together to solve problems, even when people make mistakes. Dad, Grandpa Edgar was also family, and you just spent the afternoon trying to override his wishes and steal money he specifically chose to give me. I responded with accuracy about their selective application of family loyalty principles. If family relationships were really important to you, you would have respected his inheritance decisions instead of trying to force me to redistribute his gift. The logical contradiction between demanding family loyalty from me while refusing to show family respect to my grandfather's memory and wishes was both obvious and revealing about their fundamental inability to understand reciprocity and consistency in family relationships. As my family left the conference room that day, defeated and financially diminished by consequences they had triggered through their own greed, I realized that my grandfather's inheritance had given me more than money. It had given me clarity about family relationships and the freedom to honor his values rather than enabling behavior that would have dishonored his memory and his deliberate choices about character and worthiness. The $25 million inheritance that my family had tried to steal was now safely mine to use exactly as my grandfather had hoped, to help children who had nothing while demonstrating that true wealth comes from compassion rather than accumulation, and that character matters more than bank account balances when determining who deserves to inherit the resources that can change lives and communities. The establishment of the Edgar Hamilton Foundation for Children's Education became my first priority after claiming my inheritance, as I worked to honor my grandfather's memory, while using his financial gift to create opportunities for underprivileged students who reminded me daily why he had chosen to support someone dedicated to service rather than those motivated primarily by personal accumulation. Mr. Peterson, I want to establish a foundation that provides scholarships, school supplies, and educational support for children from low-income families. I explained during our meeting to structure my grandfather's inheritance for maximum impact on the communities I had been serving throughout my teaching career. Grandpa always said that education was the greatest gift anyone could give or receive. The foundation planning process revealed the full scope of my grandfather's financial legacy and his sophisticated understanding of how wealth could be used to create lasting positive change, rather than simply providing comfort and luxury for family members who already had adequate resources for their basic needs. Your grandfather included detailed suggestions for educational initiatives he hoped you would consider, Mr. Peterson said as he reviewed notes Edgar Hamilton had prepared about his vision for using his inheritance to help children escape poverty through educational opportunities and support. The comprehensive foundation structure that emerged from our planning included full college scholarships for academically promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds, funding for school programs in underserved communities, and support for teachers who chose to work in challenging environments where their dedication could make the greatest difference. We'll also establish an emergency assistance fund for families facing educational crises, I added, as we developed programs that would address the real-world obstacles that prevented talented children from achieving their academic potential despite their intelligence and motivation. The foundation work was both emotionally rewarding and practically challenging, as I learned to manage large-scale philanthropic operations while maintaining my connection to classroom teaching that kept me grounded in the daily realities of education and child development. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my foundation work was the opportunity to invite my family members to participate in educational initiatives that could have restored their access to trust funds and family financial opportunities, if they had been willing to demonstrate genuine commitment to helping others rather than expecting payment for their participation. Grace, we'd be willing to volunteer with your foundation programs, Michael called 6 months after the disastrous will reading, apparently hoping that token charitable involvement might reverse the financial consequences of their earlier behavior. But we'd need compensation for our time since we have professional obligations that pay much better than volunteer work. The expectation that volunteer work with disadvantaged children should include financial compensation revealed everything I needed to know about their continued inability to understand the values that had motivated my grandfather's inheritance decisions and my own career choices. Michael, the whole point of volunteer work is helping others without expecting personal benefit, I replied with clarity about the fundamental difference between service and employment. If you're only willing to help children when you receive payment, then you're not ready to understand what Grandpa valued in people or why he chose to support educational charity. We have bills to pay and professional responsibilities, Jennifer added with justification for their refusal to provide unpaid service. We can't afford to spend time on charity work when we need to focus on rebuilding our careers and financial security. The prioritization of personal financial recovery over helping children who had far greater needs revealed their continued focus on accumulation rather than compassion, proving that my grandfather's assessment of their character had been accurate and his inheritance decisions had been appropriate. Have you ever offered people a chance to redeem themselves through service to others, only to discover that they viewed helping disadvantaged children as a burden rather than an opportunity? That's exactly what I experienced as my family demonstrated their continued inability to understand the values that created real wealth and meaningful relationships. Grace, you have enough money to pay us for volunteer work if you really wanted our participation, Helen suggested, with the same entitlement that had characterized their original demands for inheritance redistribution. You could easily afford to compensate family members who are willing to help with your foundation programs. The suggestion that I should pay them to volunteer with children was so fundamentally contradictory to the concept of charitable service that it perfectly captured their inability to understand why my grandfather had chosen character over financial success when deciding how to distribute his wealth. 2 years after establishing the Edgar Hamilton Foundation, I had provided college scholarships for 127 students, funded educational programs in 23 schools, and supported teachers working in challenging environments where their dedication made profound differences in children's lives. The foundation had become exactly what my grandfather had envisioned, a vehicle for using wealth to create opportunities rather than accumulating assets for personal comfort. Ms. Hamilton, the foundation has changed my entire life trajectory, wrote Maria Santos, one of our scholarship recipients who had graduated from college and was now teaching in the same underserved community where she had grown up. Your grandfather's inheritance is still helping children because you chose to honor his values instead of keeping the money for yourself. The letters from scholarship recipients and their families provided constant reminders about the difference between using wealth for personal accumulation versus using it for community transformation, validating my grandfather's decision to trust someone who would prioritize service over luxury and children's needs over family greed. Meanwhile, my family members continued to struggle with the financial consequences of their inheritance behavior, having lost access to educational trusts, emergency assistance funds, and business opportunities that would have provided the security they had tried to steal from my grandfather's deliberate distribution of his estate. Grace has built something amazing with Grandpa's money, I heard through mutual acquaintances who occasionally provided updates about family members who were no longer part of my daily experience. The foundation helps hundreds of children every year, and she still teaches in the same school where she started her career. The recognition of my foundation's impact and my continued commitment to classroom teaching was exactly what my grandfather had hoped to achieve through his inheritance decision. Proof that wealth was most valuable when it amplified someone's existing compassion rather than creating new obligations or changing fundamental character traits. 3 years after the will reading that had permanently altered our family relationships, I received an invitation to my parents' 40th wedding anniversary celebration, apparently representing their hope that time and family tradition might heal the relationships damaged by their greed and violence during the inheritance crisis. "We'd love to have you at our anniversary party," Helen's invitation read, "and we hope you'll consider this an opportunity for our family to move forward together despite the difficulties we experienced during Dad's estate settlement." The characterization of their coercion attempt and document destruction as difficulties during estate settlement, rather than acknowledging their attempted theft and violence, revealed their continued inability to take responsibility for behavior that had permanently altered our family dynamics. "Mom, I appreciate the invitation, but I don't think we can move forward together until you understand what you did wrong and why Grandpa's inheritance decisions were based on accurate assessments of family character," I replied with honesty about the conditions that would be necessary for any relationship repair. "Grace, we made some mistakes when we were emotional about money, but holding grudges forever isn't healthy for anyone," William responded with the same dismissive attitude that had characterized their approach to taking responsibility for their behavior. "Dad, you didn't make mistakes," I said with clarity about the distinction between errors in judgment and deliberate attempts to steal inheritance through coercion and violence. "You made calculated decisions to try to force me to give up money that Grandpa specifically chose to give me, and when persuasion didn't work, Michael destroyed what he thought were my legal documents." The correction about their behavior being deliberate rather than mistaken was important, since it addressed their continued attempts to minimize the significance of their actions and avoid acknowledging the character flaws that had motivated my grandfather's inheritance decisions. "Besides," I continued, "Grandpa's inheritance isn't just sitting in my bank account. It's helping children get educations they could never afford, supporting teachers in underserved schools, and creating opportunities for families who have nothing." That's exactly what he hoped would happen when he chose character over financial success in his beneficiary decisions. The explanation of how my inheritance was being used for charitable purposes rather than personal luxury was both educational for my family and vindicating for my grandfather's assessment of my values and priorities compared to theirs. If you're reading this and you're dealing with family members who view your achievements or unexpected good fortune as resources they're entitled to control or redistribute, please know that protecting your ability to honor the intentions of people who chose to support you is both appropriate and necessary for maintaining your integrity and their legacy. Sometimes the people who try to steal what they couldn't earn reveal more about their own character than about your obligations. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is use your resources to help others while allowing greedy family members to face the consequences of their choices. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever received support or opportunities that family members tried to control or redistribute? How did you handle relatives who felt entitled to benefits that someone specifically chose to give you? Your story might help someone else who's struggling with family greed and the challenge of honoring benefactors' intentions while managing family pressure. Thank you for joining me on this journey from unexpected inheritance through family betrayal to meaningful philanthropy and personal fulfillment. Remember that true wealth is measured by your impact on others rather than your bank account balance, and that the right person to inherit resources is often the one who doesn't desperately want them for personal gain. See you in our next story here at Her Sweet Revenge.